Hi, welcome to this lecture. In this lecture, we are going to dive right into the CSS box model. Okay, what exactly is this CSS box model? Well, the CSS box model is a way that elements represent themselves on a web page in terms of space. Let us say, for example, we have h1 element and we give that h1 element a specific width and specific height that is going to control horizontal and vertical spacing that element takes off on a web page, right? Now, in addition to that, we have few other properties which control its spacing also. And the first thing is the padding, which is an internal spacing. And after that, we have border. And it can be 1 pixel or 20 pixels thick, however thick you want it to be. That also controls space within the document. And finally, we got this margin property, which controls the space between different elements on a web page. Every single element on a web page has these 4 boxes around it. Everything goes inside content box. The content can be text, image, video. So everything goes inside this content box. The margin, border and padding boxes are invisible unless you specify them. The padding is invisible, border is invisible, and the margin is also invisible. So that is the CSS element box model at a glance. What we are going to do now is to jump into the code and have a look at an example. Okay, I will go to index.html file and we have this h1 element in this web page, and I'm going to take this h1 element as an example for CSS box model. I'm going to open this index.html file inside the web browser and I'm going to click on this open in browser icon. Okay, it is already opened. This is h1 element and I'm going to inspect this h1 element. Now I'm going to show you something important. As you can see that inside the Chrome developer tools, I have this h1 element selected and these are the styles for this h1 element. By the way, these are the default styles applied by the browser to this h1 element. And this is the box model for this h1 element. You can say that this is CSS box model, and this is the content box, this is the padding box, this is the border box, and this is the margin box. Right now there is no padding, no border, and this margin value is applied by the browser. So let us apply some spacing for this h1 element. I'll go to style.css. Inside style.css, I'm going to write comment. And the comment is CSS box model example. Okay, now I'm going to specify some space for this h1 element, and I have to select this h1 element inside the style.css, and for that I'm going to write h1 and then opening and closing curly braces. First, let me specify width and height for this h1 element. I'm going to write the CSS width property and the width should be 250 pixels. After that, I'm going to specify the height property and the height should be 50 pixels. These values are going to control the horizontal and vertical spacing for this h1 element. Second, I am going to apply some internal spacing for this h1 element, and to apply an internal spacing we use CSS padding property. I am going to write CSS padding property. I am going to set the top, right, bottom, left padding for this h1 element, and I'm going to specify these values. And the top padding should be 10 pixels and the right padding should be 10 pixels and the bottom padding should be 10 pixels and the left padding should also be 10 pixels. These values are going to create 10 pixels top, right, bottom and left internal spacing for this h1 element, and these values go like this way. This is top, this is right, this is bottom, and this is left. Third, I am going to set the border for this h1 element, and for border I am going to use the CSS border property, and I'll set the thickness for this border to be 5 pixels and it should be solid green. Fourth, I'm going to apply some external spacing for this h1 element, and to apply an external spacing we use CSS margin property, and I'm going to set the top margin as 20 pixels and right margin as 10 pixels and bottom margin as 60 pixels and left as 40 pixels. These values are going to create an external spacing around this h1 element. Okay, now let me show you the actual CSS box spacing inside the web browser. I'll go ahead, I'll save these changes, and I'm going to refresh this web page. Okay, we have this h1 element selected inside the Chrome Developer Tools, and these are the spacing values for this h1 element. Okay, and this is the box model for this h1 element. This is the content box, and the dimensions for this content box is 250 by 50 pixels, which we specify by using width and height properties. Okay, so this is the content box and this is the padding box, and we specify an internal spacing for this h1 element which is 10 pixels, and after that we specify 5 pixels solid border with green color, and you can see that the color of the border is green. After that we specify some external spacing, and this is the top margin 20 pixels, this is the right margin with 10 pixels, and this is the bottom margin with 60 pixels, and this is the left margin with 40 pixels. So this is the box model for this h1 element, and by using margin, padding, border and width and height we control the spacing for an element. So always remember, everything goes inside the content box, and the padding is used to generate space around an element, I mean the internal space, and border is just a border around an element, and the margin is used to generate space around the content but outside of border box. Okay, that is all about CSS box model. Understanding CSS box model is very important because we would be adjusting layout of elements for solo website. So therefore it is important to understand how an element box model works. I will delete these CSS because we don't need them. Okay, that's it about CSS box model, and I'll see you in next class. Thanks.